This week, American and Russian leaders head to Saudi Arabia for talks that could stop the fighting in Ukraine. But if there is a deal, who's going to keep the peace? So far, Mr. Putin is piling on the pressure. Can President Trump rein him in? And does he want to? Britain's bidding to be the chief peacemaker. But how are we going to pay the bill? Meanwhile, in the Reform Party, Farage's five are at war with themselves. Maybe they need a mediator. Don't all rush at once. The government says it'll reform the civil service again. We'll talk about that and cuts to welfare spending with the Cabinet Office Minister, Pat McFadden. We'll talk to the Deputy Leader of Reform, Richard Tice, about that flaming row in the party and the suspension of an MP. At the last election, the Conservatives said they'd bring back national service. So what about conscription now? I'll be joined by Shadow Home Secretary Trevor Phillips. The Latvian president says other European countries absolutely should consider conscription. We'll bring you an exclusive interview with Edgars Rinkovic. Plus, with us throughout the show, Times columnist Fraser Nelson, head of Bloomberg Economics and Politics Stephanie Flanders, and journalist and broadcaster Steve Richards. Welcome to Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. As those astonishing scenes in the Oval Office reminded us recently, American English is full of vivid sayings. Example, you've got no cards. Then there's never let your mouth write a cheque that your body can't cash. That's a pretty sage piece of advice, especially if you're talking about the defence of your entire continent. Europe's leaders, Sir Keir Starmer, Emmanuel Macron and Friedrich Merz, are making large promises, hundreds of billions of pounds worth of weaponry, to President Zelensky. Of course, since the last war, Europe's always had a rich friend in Washington, happy to pick up the defence tab when we were a bit skint. No longer. All bets are off. President Trump complains that we've been freeloading too long. He wants us to put our money where our mouth is. The problem is, we haven't got any money. We are flat broke. The Prime Minister's told our Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, that she's going to have to find a way of bankrolling our armed forces to the tune of 2.5% of GDP. Several billion pounds more than she'd planned without more taxes or borrowing. I think in the Midwest, they call that a hospital pass. As our Texan cousins might say, Houston, we have a problem. Let's start this morning with the government. A little earlier, I spoke to the Cabinet Office Minister, Pat McFadden. Pat McFadden, given the fact that the threats to MPs are now routine, are you alarmed that a man was able to get onto the parliamentary estate and climb Big Ben without being stopped?
I don't know if he posed any danger. I think the person's now down. I understand he's been arrested. It's an important national building. Of course, we want to see it protected, but I think the police have done their job. The person's down and he's been arrested.
But there's any nervousness about threats to MPs? I mean...
Oh, in general?
Yeah,
of course. Look, in the years that I've been in Parliament, 2 MPs have been killed. One has been, fortunate to escape with his life. So I think it's something that we're all aware of. I don't want to put that straight at this latest incident, but in general, we have a very open democracy in this country where MPs walk around mostly without physical police protection in their constituencies. The advice surgery is still something that we do and we like doing, and we cherish that face-to-face content with constituents, as well as other similar things like coffee mornings that I do regularly. So it's really important that we keep that and that MPs are available to the public.
All right. This weekend, the Americans withdrew access to satellite imagery, certain kinds of information from the Ukrainians. Were they wrong to do so?
Well, it's their decision. It's not something that we've done. We support Ukraine. We continue to supply Ukraine with weapons, with intelligence support, with help on the cyber front, because we believe that they're engaged in a really important fight for their country's freedom and the capacity to decide their own future.
But you know that the Ukrainians will be saying, here we are, you say you support us, but actually you're sending us into days of war with our hands tied behind our back. It's weakened our defences. The United Nations called yesterday one of the deadliest days for civilians in the war. Would you acknowledge that the White House perhaps shares some responsibilities for the deaths of the last 24, 48 hours?
There's no doubt about the UK government's position. You saw the way that Prime Minister Keir Starmer greeted President Zelensky last weekend, the attendance at the Summit of European Leaders, his meeting with the King and so on. There's no doubt where the UK stands.
But you know, I'm asking you about the Americans.
With regard to the United States...
They're meant to be our closest allies.
Yeah, and they are.
Should they be doing this?
Look, with regard to the United States, what they're trying to do is bring the war to an end. I think that aim is shared by everyone. What we want to secure is not just an end to the fighting, but a peace that lasts. And that has underlined every action the Prime Minister has taken in recent weeks, because it will do nothing to secure Ukraine's future if we have a temporary ceasefire which lasts only as long as President Putin wants it to, and to start up again. And that's what's happened in the past. We've had cessations that haven't lasted.
That is fully understood. But should the path to a lasting peace lie via, if you can put it this way, extra Ukrainian deaths? Because as a negotiating tactic with the Ukrainians, the United States is withdrawing its support and therefore exposing Ukrainian civilians to more danger.
Well, that's not something we've done.
I know, but I'm asking you as an ally, what should we be saying to the Americans about this? Is this morally or tactically even correct?
Well, my colleague, the Defence Secretary John Healey, was in the United States speaking to them precisely about this in the last couple of days. And all the way through, what we say in public and what we say in private is the same, is that yes, we share the American desire for the war to come to an end, but we also want to make sure it's done in a way that the peace lasts. That's why we've been talking about security guarantees and making sure that behind a ceasefire there is a backstop to make sure that that ceasefire doesn't just last as long as Putin wants, because that's what happened in the past, and that will not leave Ukraine in a secure position in the future.
There is a problem here, isn't there, that the United States, I know you'll tell me we are the close allies and so on, but they seem increasingly unreliable. The American president says that he finds Vladimir Putin easier to deal with than Volodymyr Zelensky. Well, first, does our Prime Minister endorse that judgment?
It's not the view we take of President Putin. I think our views are on the record on that.
Don't you think it's a bizarre thing to say?
Well, you know, what I've learned in recent weeks is that the best way to conduct interviews is not to see everything through the lens of what's just been said in the United States. What's important is what is done.
One might interpret that as the best way for British government ministers to conduct interviews is never to say anything that they think about Donald Trump.
No, look, I do these interviews pretty regularly, as you know, and in recent weeks, much of the pattern is, what do you think of the latest comment on X that's just come out of the United States? We've taken a sensible decision, I think, not to conduct our diplomacy like that. We will continue to speak to the Americans, who are huge allies and friends. There's a lot of deep values that underline this relationship that keep it strong. So we'll keep doing that. But what's important here is what happens, to make a serious point. And what we want is a peace in Ukraine that lasts. And that means a peace that's secure.
Well, indeed.
And that's what we're driving for every day.
Indeed. And keeping the peace is, of course, one of the issues here. Prime Minister's offered peacekeeping forces, but every military leader says that our 75,000 strong army can't possibly do this by itself or even fulfill the share of the peacekeeping that the Ukrainians want. I spoke to the Latvian president, and he says that he thinks that what Latvians are doing, which is conscription, should be considered by other European countries in order to make sure that we have the forces. Is that something that we would consider?
We're not considering conscription, but of course we've announced a major increase in defence expenditure a couple of weeks ago. And we do have to recognise that the world has changed here. The phrase step up is used a lot in recent weeks, and Europe does have to step up in terms of its own defence. President Trump isn't actually the first president to say that, but he said it
Indeed.
more loudly
Obama and Biden
and with more force than his predecessors. So I think we've got to recognise that moment. And there is another important point here. When the world is changing as fast as it is, it's important that we don't cling on to old assumptions. And I think the Prime Minister's played a tremendous role in recent weeks in responding to that situation and explaining it to the public. And that's why the decision on increasing defence expenditure was needed. And it may be why other decisions are needed in the future that respond to a new reality and that we don't find ourselves caught operating under the same assumptions as we used to in the past when the situation has changed.
Just a quick question about that new reality. Does it involve a bigger army?
Well, we've got a strategic defence review led by Lord Robertson.
I know, I'm not asking about direction of
so
travel.
let that report, and it will set out quite a lot about how this extra investment in defence should be, what that should be spent on. One thing's for sure, you would not spend that money today on the same things as you would 10 years ago. The experience of 3 years of the war in Ukraine has shown just how fast the battlefield is changing in terms of cyber, in terms of drones, in terms of the use of intelligence. So I don't think we would spend the money this time the way that we would have done 10 or 20 years ago. But that's precisely why we commissioned Lord Robertson and his colleagues to do the review that they've been engaged in.
OK, let's talk about the money. Prime Minister told the Chancellor she's got to get us to defence spending of 2.5% of gross domestic product. Under the Chancellor's own rules, she can't borrow more. She's promised she won't raise taxes on working people. Is one way to square the circle simply to change the rules so that defence spending, or some of it, just doesn't count against current expenditure?
But it will always count in some way. There's quite a lot of this around. Let's just change
Speaking
the rules.
as a former Chief Secretary of the Treasury.
It will always count in some way. If you try to place it in some off-balance sheet thing and so on, you still have to borrow that money. You still have to account for it in some way. There is
no fiddling about with the rules.
There's no cost-free way of doing this. It has to be paid for in some way. Now, there's a perfectly legitimate debate about how you pay for things. That's always true in politics. What there isn't is just a free way to do this.
OK, so there's no fiddling with the rules. Let's talk about how you pay. There are obviously cuts coming. How many civil servants do you expect and plan to lose by the end of this Parliament?
Well, I don't want to do it like that, and that's precisely why I'm not operating in the same way as
well, you've got to do it somehow. You're paying them. Where are you going to get the money from? Are there going to be fewer civil servants?
The last government announced these targets. I think Boris Johnson said he'd get rid of 90-odd thousand. The later Conservative government said 66,000. What happened after that? Hiring went up. What's really important here is the state has to reform. Now, some of this is about the number of central civil servants. What I'd like to see
so there could be a reduction in headcount?
There could be, but what I'd like to see is fewer civil servants working in central London, more working in the regions where the property is cheaper and where we can spread around the career opportunities in the civil service. I'd like to see more teachers in our schools. I'd like to see more police officers in our streets. I'd like to see more technology applied to some of the repetitive tasks that we have that can enhance some of the jobs that people are doing. There's a whole lot of change coming. There is change in the private sphere. The public sphere cannot be immune from it.
I do just want to ask a question, simple question again. Do you want to see fewer civil servants at the end of this parliamentary term or not?
I want to see the most productive civil service we have. I think that will mean fewer in some areas, but let me just make a serious point here, Trevor, because we are a centre-left government that believes in the power of public provision. That's why we fought the election on a promise to hire more teachers, to hire more police officers. We need the people in the NHS to get the waiting list down, and we have to allocate resources that make sure these things happen.
Let me just have one more bash at this. Me and you and the Chancellor's watching. What you said so far has not communicated to her that you are going to respond to her request to reduce the spend. So how is anything that you've told me going to reduce the cost of the civil service and help her meet her financial targets?
Look, I think we can reduce the cost of the government overhead with a smart application of technology, with the right incentives for the vast majority of civil servants who are doing a good job. Do you know when we asked the civil service, what is it you most want to see? They said better performance management. All right. And that's what we want to do.
OK, Chancellor's not getting a penny out of you by the sound of it. Let's look at somebody else's money. One other area where you could find cuts is welfare reform. Will some of the money the Chancellor needs come out of disability benefits?
We do have a package of welfare changes coming. It'll come pretty soon. And this area of disability benefits is really important. Let me just set out for you and your viewers what is happening here. We have over 9 million people of working age in the country who are not working. Now, some of those are early retirees and so on. But about 30% of those are people on long-term sickness benefits, about 2.8 million people. The cost of this has gone up by about £20 billion in the past few years. Furthermore, the do-nothing trajectory, if you like, is for it to rise to over 4 million people by the end of the decade. That's not fair on the people involved, and it's not fair on the taxpayer. So yes, we do have to act on this to make sure that we give everyone in the country the opportunity to work. We are the Labour Party. The clue is in the name. We cannot be relaxed about every year hundreds of thousands more people going on these benefits. And the UK is an outlier here. The UK is an outlier. We're the only country in the G7 not to recover the pre-pandemic ratio of employment. So we've got to act here.
I hear the message, work is good for you, but still haven't quite answered my question. Does this mean that the welfare bill is going to be cut, and in particular, the amount of money that we spend on disability benefits?
Well, wait to see our proposals, but there will be changes in long-term disability benefits because we cannot sit back and let this bill grow and write people off in the way that's happened for many years. We're going to provide really important employment support. 200,000 people among the 2.8 million have said that they would work tomorrow with the right support. We've got a duty to put that support in place. That will be better for them, and it will get the bill down for the country.
Pat McFadden, thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you.
Well, let's see what our panel made of all that. We're joined all morning by Times columnist Fraser Nelson, the head of Bloomberg Economics and Politics, Stephanie Flanders, and journalist and broadcaster Steve Richards. Let's just start with this weekend's events. Stephanie, the Americans are essentially pulling their support for the Ukrainians' war effort. What should Britain be saying about this? Pat McFadden seemed to be saying, oh, well, we're not doing that, but we should be honest with our allies about what we think, shouldn't we?
I think we have made it clear in so many words, I guess, that we continue to support Ukraine, and we obviously can't consistently sustain that line without also saying we want the kinds of support that the US has now withdrawn to be brought back or to be somehow mirrored or replicated by other allies in Europe. So I think, but the problem for the Prime Minister obviously is managing that line without saying something that's aggressively against President Trump. But the President has clearly decided that he's not getting very punished among his sort of core support for being tough on Ukraine. There is a great desire among his supporters to bring peace. And he's realising, or he's at least decided, that these really aggressive removal of all levels of support is the only way to do that on his kind of timetable. But I don't think, I mean, there's no question, I don't think the UK has been particularly weak on this. There's just a practicality about how the Europeans can continue to work together. How
do you think this plays out, Fraser, that will the Ukrainians essentially have to buckle?
Well, if Britain supports Ukraine enough and the rest of Europe, at least you give Zelensky some leverage where you can say to Trump, look, you might walk away from me, but my European friends are going to keep fighting. You can't force me to sign a deal, and I will continue to fight. The odds might be against me. But right now, it seems that Europe's countries are verbally quite willing to say to him, look, we'll be with you even if Trump walks away. The problem is, when it comes down to it, Britain doesn't have the manpower to send troops to Ukraine. We say we will, but it suits us to pretend that we will. It suits Zelensky to pretend that we will. But you would need at least sort of 9 battalions out there, 20,000 men, to have any sort of serious impact. And at most, we could send one kind of weak battalion. So right now, we are trying to strengthen Zelensky's hand by making promises which he knows and the Americans knows we couldn't keep.
See, the problem here is, to use the president's vernacular, he's got all the cards.
He has. Well, as in Trump has got all the cards. Yeah. And he remains the key player. I mean, Britain could say what it wants, but it seems to me this dance with interviews with British politicians will continue until the crunch moment, which will be, if there is a ceasefire, what form it takes. And when you say, will Zelensky buckle, to some extent he already has, because we saw from that White House gathering, the famous one the Friday before last, where he openly in front of the camera said no to a ceasefire. So that wouldn't work. They haven't worked before. Well, now everyone is talking. If there is going to be a deal, it's a ceasefire. It's not going to be bigger than that, although that in itself would be big. So it's the form, isn't it, that this ceasefire might take, which is the crunch moment for the relatively marginal players like Britain and France. And until then, there's not much they can do.
But the real jeopardy here for the Europeans is it's quite clear. People talk about how President Trump, the reason why people thought he wouldn't push for a deal is he didn't want, quote unquote, another Afghanistan. But if you think about what actually happened in Afghanistan, he took the credit for the deal to withdraw and not the blame for the mess that went wrong afterwards. And that's exactly what he's trying to do here. He wants to take credit for having pushed with maximum pressure to get some kind of peace deal at any price, and have the Europeans take maximum responsibility for everything that happens afterwards. And of course, that is exactly how it's playing out so far. And Fraser's right, they have to think really clearly about what the next steps are and how they can credibly underpin a deal so that isn't how it transpires. I mean, I think given that he's still president, he will still take a lot of blame if it really falls apart in Ukraine. But there is he definitely wants to be able to blame Europe.
He's not only applying pressure to the Ukrainians, he's applying pressure to the Europeans. And now Europeans suddenly are talking about vast increases in defence spending. Now, in our case, got to come from somewhere. And Pat McFadden is he's trailing this morning in newspapers, though he was rather Sphinx-like about it in his interview, that there's going to be civil servants sacked all over the place. Is that going to happen?
Look, we have been told for years, mainly by Conservatives, that there's going to be an absolute cap on civil service numbers. Now, that's a false economy, because what they do is use consultants instead, and the numbers still go up. We saw this after Brexit.
You're absolutely right. We can see it here.
Yeah. And that has been the story. And you should insert in that graph a number of times ministers have said, now on, there's a complete cap on civil service numbers. But that's, but if you look at the cost of departments, that's the way to do it, not at accrued headcount. I think Pat McFadden's quite right not to play that game. But also, this is penny pinching compared to the money needed for defence. Now, if you look at what they're discussing now about sort of raid and disability benefits, that sounds like Treasury tinkering. What he needs is a fundamental plan to move people from welfare into work by their hundreds of thousands.
I want to come back to that in a second, but Stephanie, you reckon this is not going to happen?
I just think, I mean, even just looking at that, you sort of, we saw a lot of in austerity, there was a lot of focus on getting those numbers down, and a very kind of roughshod way of squeezing local government spending was quite a good way to do that. But we saw all the sort of long-term costs of that squeeze that have been sort of ill thought out, that have been applauded just in terms of the numbers that were lost. So I think, Fraser's right. The real number, it's the same as it's happening in the US. The focus of the Elon Musk efforts of the sort of people working in these departments is a fraction of the overall budget when you're actually talking about, in the case of US, entitlement spending, benefit spending, and here that health-related benefit bill.
And it's interesting, you can see, I didn't, because our interviews can't be as long as I'd like them to be, I didn't get to say to Pat McFadden, by the way, the place where the number of the civil servants has gone up most is in his department, the Cabinet Office. The thing is, though, Steve, that there's an issue here, I think, of Labour politics, isn't there? A couple of weeks ago, we saw the international development budget being raided to pay for defence. We're now talking about the public sector being raided to pay for defence. In a minute, we'll talk about the welfare benefits bill being raided. All of these things are not policies you would associate normally with the Labour Party.
And it's dangerous. I mean, at the moment, there are sort of words being bandied around. You know, we must increase defence. No analysis, as Pat McFadden acknowledged, you have to wait for this defence review to find out precisely where and in what form. But anyway, we must increase defence. And at the same time, there are these cuts being talked about. And certainly in terms of Labour history, this is potentially explosive. I mean, just for 10 seconds to go back to the early 50s when Harold Wilson and Nye Bevan resigned from the Attlee government, it was over increased defence spending, paid for, in effect, by cuts in the NHS. They introduced prescription charges. And that split lasted for decades, and in some respects is still in place to this very day, and will at some point manifest itself. At the moment, they haven't got those so-called hard choices yet, but they're coming within weeks. And I think the tensions will begin to be much deeper than the resignation of one minister. But what form they take, I don't know. But these are risky decisions for a Labour government.
Fraser, you think that there are ways in which they can make this happen?
Yes, and they can describe it rightly as a great progressive mission. If they cut the bill of social failure, if they manage to reduce the staggering number, 3.5 million people on sickness benefits, that's gone up by 1 million in just the last 5 years. Now, if those 1 million people were in the workforce instead, studies show that we'll be having £30 billion more in tax revenue by the end of this Parliament, as well as 10 billion less in welfare payments. Put that together, there is the 40 billion you need for the defence. So if you approach this in a George Osborne kind of penny-pinching way, let's take this away from civil service, that away from the NHS, that won't get you what you need. If you have a huge Labour Party full employment drive for social inclusion to repair the social damage of dysfunctional welfare, then you can hit your growth goal, you can hit your employment goal, you can get your defence spending and have enough left over for tax cuts. Stephanie,
you've probably got the best maths of the four of us. Does that work for you?
Well, I mean, Fraser's right. I keep saying Fraser's right. I'm going to have to stop agreeing with you. It's too painful. But I think, I mean, if you think about, these are actually the debates that are going on now between the fiscal watchdog, the Office for Budget Responsibility, and the Treasury, even in a small way, about what cuts to the welfare budget they will allow to have, will accept are going to be long term. And if you think about, there's 3 ways to cut the bill. You can make it harder for people to get them in the first place, these benefits, the disability benefits and others. You can make them meaner while they're on them, lower them over time, and you can make it easier to come off. Now, obviously, the very sort of Labour-friendly focus is on the third of those, get people into work, not least because it does have a positive output in people paying taxes and adding to the tax revenues in other ways. The Office for Budget Responsibility tends to only look at the first 2 of those as things that are real cost savers, especially lowering the overall. So I think in this round, you will have a combination of those 2, but if you even just got back to the pace of exit from benefits that you had 10 or 15 years ago, you would start saving real money.
And in a way, in presentational terms, I think if they were really serious about this, they should have done this, a big announcement on, say, day 3 of the government, that they're going to do a beverage kind of report on, this time, welfare to work, pathways to work. And there are clearly savings. I mean, I agree with Fraser, there are billions of pounds of savings. But in the short term, they might need to invest in mediating these pathways to work, which will not be cheap, etc. So as ever with these things, it's not straightforward.
It is now 9 o'clock. You're watching Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. In the last hour, the Cabinet Office Minister, Pat McFadden, has told this programme he doesn't take the same view as President Trump when he said it was easier to deal with Russia than Ukraine. McFadden said that the government had no plans to introduce conscription. Now, lots more to come this morning. Shortly, we'll ask whether the ejection of Rupert Lowe has sparked a civil war within Reform UK. We'll be joined live by their Deputy Leader, Richard Tice. Then we'll speak to the Shadow Home Secretary, Chris Philp, on defence, immigration, and that famous promise to reintroduce national service. Plus, the stark message from the land Vladimir Putin may have in his sights. Latvia's president tells us that Europe is very weak militarily, and we should look at conscription to tackle the Russian threat. That's later in the hour. Well, there is a right old scrap going on in Reform UK. Earlier in the week, one of the party's 5 MPs, Rupert Lowe, made some disparaging comments about leader Nigel Farage, saying Reform remains a protest party led by the Messiah. Then the party reported the Great Yarmouth MP to the police and said it had received evidence of serious bullying and derogatory remarks made about women. They also said he had made threats of violence against the party's chairman. Rupert Lowe has been suspended, but he said that the claims were vexatious and made because he had asked reasonable questions of Reform's leadership. Well, Deputy Leader Richard Tice joins me now.
Very good morning, Trevor.
Good morning. Shall we try and clear up where we've got to here? Can I just first ask one thing? A complaint was made to the Metropolitan Police on the 13th of December last year about Mr. Lowe's behaviour. Why is it taking so long for you to do anything about it?
Well, actually, there've been, with regard to the complaint that was made by the chairman, Zia Youssef, actually, there's more than one instance. There's 2 threats. But the key thing is this is actually very sad. It's very unfortunate. And
I want to get onto that, but it just seems 3 months is quite a long time for you to realise that you have an undesirable in your midst.
There's been a variety of instances, and you have to make difficult judgments through the process. But of course, it's unfortunate. Of course, it's difficult. But there are these allegations of bullying by 2 separate female members of staff to the parliamentary authorities. Those clearly have to be dealt with in the proper, responsible way. We've also got a duty of care as a party, whether people are employed directly or indirectly. So that's why the chairman has instructed an independent investigation by a KC. That's the right and proper thing to do. That will run its course. We'd all rather that this happened. But imagine if we hadn't been open and transparent about this. Imagine if we tried to brush it under the carpet and in some way cover it up. And then it came out at a future time. Everybody would have been raging at us.
Well, I don't have to use my imagination. I'm sorry to go on about this. But I do want to ask you about the timing. To people who are cynical, I mean, as you know, I'm not, but someone cynical might say, gosh, nothing happened to this guy until he publicly made a fuss and made disparaging remarks about Nigel Farage. And then within 24 hours, he was toast.
But actually,
this is political.
And I'm happy to clarify that. As I say, there was an additional threat that was made about the chairman, Zia Youssef. And you get to a point where you can't tolerate this anymore. And it's really unfortunate. But ultimately, Rupert had been doing some great work on a variety of important issues. But ultimately, if you can't work with someone, if a situation becomes impossible, which regrettably, in our honest opinion, is where it had got to, then you have to say, this is not going to end well. And so we made the right judgment, and Zia and Nigel are doing a brilliant job. They're driving the party forward at incredible pace. We're doing something that's never been done before. We've got 400 branches. We're give or take, leading in the polls. And, of course, with that growth, there are challenges, there are difficulties.
I get the official line, but honestly...
It happens to be the reality.
Okay, I just want to try one more time. It does feel a bit fishy, doesn't it? That actually, the moment he clashes with Nigel Farage, nothing's happened until now, and the moment he clashes with Nigel Farage, suddenly he's disciplined. I mean, let me finish. Your party has made a big deal of your being defenders of free speech. This all feels a bit Putin-esque, doesn't it?
Far from it, and that's completely inappropriate. The reality is, behind the scenes, there had been a number of difficulties and challenges, and you get to the point where you say enough's enough, and particularly when you get these allegations of bullying by female staff, and you then get to the point where you've got to launch an investigation, and the chairman's made difficult decisions, and we fully support what he's done on this, and I say there were further allegations. And in a sense, you saw this pattern of behaviour when literally the last moment of the House sitting just before Christmas, I was in the chamber at the adjournment debate, and there was a very unfortunate scene that was briefly reported at the time, but not really picked up. And that was an example. And it was
This is
pretty
Mr.
uncomfortable.
Lowe's confrontation with Mike
Mike Cain, the minister,
Minister.
in the House of Commons, and it was dealt with by the Speaker's office, and Rupert had to apologise quite properly. But it was a bad moment, and I think just an indication of the challenges that we'd faced.
Your colleague Lee Anderson wrote yesterday that our country must come first.
Absolutely.
And no man is bigger than our party. I think he was probably referring to Mr. Lowe. But does that expression, no man, include Nigel Farage?
Look, at the end of the day, the country must come first, because the country's in a terrible state. The Tories have broken Britain. Labour's in the process of bankrupting Britain. We can't keep spending more than we're earning. And the reason we're doing so well in the polls is that we're challenging the consensus narrative on things like mass immigration, on things like net stupid zero, that are destroying the growth of this country, destroying jobs, destroying industries like steel, like the automotive industry. These are the things that we're talking about, and that's why we're doing so well in the polls, and we are united in putting forward a different agenda that I think people want to listen to.
But I'm asking you a serious point, which is really about modern politics and the nature of your party. The part of the division seems to be the question of whether the Reform Party is a party which has a series of personalities, has a structure, a culture of its own, or whether it is, in effect, a one-man band. Would Reform be anywhere near as successful as you're telling me it is without Nigel Farage?
Well, let me remind you that actually it was me that took the party from 0 to about 15%, and then I was delighted that Nigel wanted to get stuck back into politics.
Why did you move over if you were so successful?
Because
he was old news.
Because Nigel's the most experienced, most successful, most recognised politician in the country, and I knew that would help drive it forwards. We didn't know the pace at which that would happen, but look, we're united, we're working incredibly hard. It's important to be united, and that's why we had to make that difficult decision. Sometimes life is not perfect. None of us are perfect. None of us never make mistakes. But stuff happens, but let's be absolutely clear. We've got to work the hardest, we've got to get the best candidates and the best policies, and if we keep doing that, we'll do well in these May elections, well next May in the devolved nation elections.
I do want to ask you a question about policy, but honestly, there's history here, isn't there? Something like this happened with the Brexit Party. Something like this always happens with Nigel Farage. No doubt, great communicator, big presence and so on, but every party he's been in has founded on
Are you suggesting that there haven't been sort of personality issues between other parties and people?
Yeah, I'm not talking about other. I'm not talking to other parties. I'm talking to you.
You are indeed. But here's the point: no one thought we could get to 25, 26, 27% in the polls, 7% ahead of the Tories as of a poll yesterday. Look, we're doing well. Is it difficult? Yes. Is it right to have scrutiny? Of course it is, because we're suggesting that we could run the country better than the other lot. So that's fair and easy, and we're delighted to have that scrutiny.
If you were going to run the country, you'd be dealing with the biggest problem we have, which is how we deal with Mr. Trump and Ukraine and so on. You're in favour of increased defence spending, but how's your party dealing with Mr. Trump, given that Nigel Farage is conspicuously his best friend?
Well, we're delighted that
His behaviour last week in the
let's be very
Oval
clear.
Office was OK with you?
I'm delighted that the Prime Minister and the Labour government is now copying reform policy. We were the only party in the election that had 2.5% on GDP within 3 years on defence spending and then 3% within 6 years.
And
so the Prime Minister's done the right thing in copying that. In the same way, he's doing the right thing announcing today to fire useless civil servants. Again, part of our policy. Look, with regard to Mr Trump, isn't it a Brexit benefit that we quite rightly have reminded the Prime Minister of, that the PM, on behalf of the country, can help bring people together, European nation leaders and the President of the US.
You were OK with that scene in the Oval Office. You're OK with him saying that Putin is easier to deal with than Zelensky? You're OK with that?
I've been very clear on the media for the last week, including on Question Time on Thursday night. Those scenes were regrettable, uncomfortable. What I said, and I've said consistently, is, of course, difficult, tense, hard peace negotiations should take place behind closed doors. I've been robustly in support of Ukraine since day one. I'm the guy that donated a five-figure sum 13 months ago, bought a pickup truck, filled it with medical supplies, drove to Ukraine with other volunteers. So, we are robust in that support. But equally, it must be right to have peace, if we can.
Richard Tice, thank you for your time this morning. Right, let's go back to our panel, Fraser Nelson, Stephanie Flanders and Steve Richards. Steve, you're an observer of political feuds by the gazillion. I mean, mainly on the left. But how are you reading reform?
I think it's really interesting, this moment, because Reform has had success portraying itself as the anti-politics party, which is actually a contradiction in terms. Any party is inevitably going to engage with all the challenges of politics. And now, at first, you can play that card, join the People's Revolt, and there's Nigel Farage and Richard Tice. But when you have a parliamentary party, you have to manage it. And although it's a small party, they've just lost 20% of it, in effect. And you then have tensions, which you have to explain in interviews with you and others. And suddenly, they become like another ordinary political party with all the dilemmas political parties face. And over time, most voters won't notice this now, but over time, I think reform will become demythologized and face real problems. This is minor compared to when they have to agree policy in detail, which they didn't really have to do at the last election, and when they are scrutinised as a parliamentary party aiming big at the next election. So I think this is an early sign of trouble to come for them.
It's a very interesting. The Conservatives must be watching this quite carefully, and to be honest, be quite happy.
Well, there's a long-time expectation that this would actually happen, that the reform basically was a plague in both your houses party. If you didn't like the Tories and you didn't like Labour, then you would go to reform as a default third option. But when they actually come to questions, what do they stand for? That's when it starts to fall apart, because there are big policy issues here. And I think they've got two main problems here. One is that Rupert Lowe was a very effective backbencher, probably more effective than most Tory backbenchers. He got a louder applause at the Reform conference from Nigel Farage, and he's got a big personal following.
That was probably his first.
That was his first. I think the die
mistake
was probably cast there. And then the other problem is, it wasn't so long ago until Nigel Farage was in America fairly recently, paying homage to the great Donald, and telling the Americans that in Britain, if you say anything, they'll throw you in jail. A kind of bizarre statement, but he was suggesting we live in a police state, that if you say things, you can get arrested. Now, what have they done? They've just referred their own MP to the police, saying it was a criminal matter to say whatever he said to the chairman, Zia Youssef. Now, unless Rupert Lowe was threatening to blow up Youssef's limo or something like that, I can't quite see why they would have to criminalise this. And yet they have chosen to use the tactics that they accuse the left of using. So right now there's an element of hypocrisy here as well.
I think there's a broader thing. I mean, the process of, can this be a real party, and does it end up inevitably being politics, involved in politics, if it's actually trying to win the next election. That was always going to unfold. I think what's accelerated it is what Donald Trump has done to the sort of global Western order. Because if you're, and that I think is the sort of fundamental problem underneath all this. They had all these structural problems, But now they have a situation, they're a party that's all about the appeal of tearing up the rule book, the end of politics as usual, throw everything out of the House. Well, if everything outside the House is being torn up or put aflame, suddenly that seems a lot less attractive to people. So I think there are all these structural issues, but it's been accelerated by the fact that actually the idea of just, throwing away everything that politicians have previously held dear just looks a bit less attractive now.
Mr. Trump has got there before them, really. OK, thank you very much. Up next, we'll hear from the Conservatives.
What's it like doing this kind of stuff when he's not here?
Yeah, I miss him. He just inspired me to be a better person. He's shown us what living looks like in the toughest and most difficult of circumstances.
I'm Greg Milam, and I'm Sky's Chief North of England correspondent.
Mandatory evacuation, you must leave!
For many people, Harvey is far from over. People here believe the water will be this deep for weeks. I've reported from around the world and around the UK. It isn't what politicians see from election battle buses, but what ordinary people see from the buses that shape the timetable of their lives.
I feel like there's no trust between the people and the politicians.
Labour's going to get in definitely, and they're no better than the Conservatives.
It is almost impossible to predict where these fires will go next. Ida has certainly left its mark on New Orleans.
It just feels heartbreaking.
Cartels in Mexico are flooding America with the drug. We are standing on the supply line right into the heart of America's opioid crisis. This gives you an idea of the strength of those winds, strong enough to bend and twist metal. Sky News, the full story first. Christchurch has been changed forever by what happened here.
There was a river of blood coming out of the mosque. That's a scene that you don't forget.
Are you trying to run me over, Sir Philip?
No, go away.
Look like it, sir. Will you respond to those who made accusations, Sir Philip?
Can you go away?
Very good morning to you all.
Morning.
Do you regret the tweet, Gary?
There's no sign, publicly at least, of either side being willing to give ground. Brianna's dad told Sky News what he thinks of them.
If I'm honest, I hate them. They're just evil. They'll always be monsters.
Free wherever you get your news. How do you reassure the public that all of these mistakes wouldn't be made again?
God forbid we should have to do this again.
We are under Israeli military restrictions in terms of some of the things that we can film, but it's important to be in there. What a slow drive for the president as he approaches his golf club.
4 more years!
Free wherever you get your news. I'm Mark Stone and I'm Sky's correspondent based here in Washington, D.C.
Sky News get the full story first.
Is this now all your territory?
Yeah.
The battlefield is outside the barricades. We are in the middle of a forest, in a jungle really, and they're attempting to keep these men alive. I'm Stuart Ramsey and I'm Sky's chief correspondent.
It's really dangerous. Many people have died riding it.
We're rolling.
Welcome to the world.
Our new podcast, starting now. It's very exciting. Every week we'll be reporting from the world's trouble spots.
We get to hold those in positions of power accountable, and we get to ask the questions that the audience, the listeners, want to know about.
And that's why it is so important that people tune in, come along for the road, come along for the journey. It'll be fun.
We've got your Sunday mornings covered. From the front page and the sounds of the streets to the voices of the people who make the major calls and big picture politics beyond Westminster. We'll put you at the heart of our story.
I'm ready. Are you?
Join me, Trevor Phillips, Sunday mornings on Sky News. Welcome back. Let's talk to the Conservatives now. A little earlier, I spoke to the Shadow Home Secretary, Chris Philp. Chris Phillips, you've been pretty much in lockstep with the government over increasing defence spending. In fact, I think, want to go a bit further. But what would you do to pay for it? People are talking now about slashing spending on disability benefits. Would that be part of your agenda?
Well, we had a plan in government to get defence spending up to 2.5% of GDP, which involved things like shrinking the size of the civil service, which had grown enormously after COVID. Unfortunately, the government cancelled that plan when they got elected and have now frantically had to put back in place a plan to get defence spending up to 2.5. So that was unfortunately 8 months that were wasted thanks to a bad decision which this government made. But we do think we need to go further and get up to 3% of GDP because global events make pretty clear, don't they, that we live in a dangerous
But how
continent now.
would you do it, is the question I'm really asking. Because when you said before, you referred to your plans. I think you were going to cut 70,000 civil service. The Institute for Government, amongst others, said that's pretty unrealistic. You're not going to be able to do it. So how would you raise defence spending to 3%? Where did you get the money from?
Yeah, well, first of all, on that civil service plan, I think it was 66,000 and it was being implemented. It was realistic, and going back to pre-COVID levels is not sort of going back to the Ice Age. It's just winding the clock back a few years. So I don't accept at all that it's unrealistic. But there are other places to look as well. And I think that does include the welfare budget, because we are spending, as a country, £140 billion a year. It's a huge amount of money on benefits, including disability benefits, but others as well, for working age people who, frankly, could be working more. There are 9.3 or 9.4 million working age adults who could be working, who are in fact not in the workforce. And getting them back into work is a critical part of saving money.
Indeed, Pat McFadden, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, said exactly the same thing to me. But which bit of the budget would you be cutting? Disability benefits, pensions. What would be your target?
Yeah.
What are you advising the government to do?
Well, I mean, in government, we had a plan, I think it was in our manifesto, that would have realised savings of £12 billion a year from the welfare budget. That would have included things like toughening up the so-called work capability assessments to make sure that only people who are really genuinely unwell are able to claim disability benefits. It's gone sort of far too wide. People are now being able to get signed off because they've got, anxiety, and are then not having to even look for a job.
Sometimes people are anxious.
Well, sometimes they are, but I think it's gone far too far, and it's costing us billions and billions of pounds a year, and we need to make the system, frankly, a little bit tougher. Benefits have actually gone up, quite significantly. The actual level of benefits have gone up quite significantly. I'm sure that is something the government ought to be looking at as well. But there are like I said, £140 billion a year that are being spent on working age benefits, people that should be working, and that figure is frankly far too high. And I say that not just because of defence spending, but to spend taxpayers' money. Every single one of those £140 billion is paid for by someone getting up early, going to work, working hard, paying their taxes, and I think the number is just too high.
Is there a danger here of a rather cruel race between you and the government to see who can be more cruel to disabled people?
No, I don't think that's right. Obviously, people who are, genuinely disabled and, seriously, genuinely unable to work, obviously should be looked after. I don't think there's anyone in British politics who would say
But you can't
otherwise.
have it both ways.
Well, but look, the number of people who have fallen into these categories is sort of far too high. The thresholds, I think, are too low. It's quite, too easy to get signed off, and we are spending too much money. And we've got to keep in mind, every single pound of that, 140 billion, is being paid for by someone who is getting up early, working hard, and paying their taxes.
All right, look, a lot of this happened on your watch, and I wonder if, looking back now, the Russian invasions of Ukraine in 2014 and 2022 happened under Conservative administrations. There's a long-term decline in defence spending, of course, but shouldn't those two moments have been a red flag that you needed to increase defence spending then, and you guys just dropped the ball?
Well, I mean, defence spending in pound terms, was at a record high, and we did have the plan to increase defence spending further to 2.5%. But look, it is clear that we live in a world
that was after 14 years in government.
Yeah, well, as I say, defence spending...
And after two invasions.
Look, I mean, defence spending in pound terms, was at a record level. We've got and we're maintaining 2 aircraft carriers No other European country has that. We've got a renewing
aircraft
deterrent
carriers without aircraft. My point is that as a percentage of GDP, you allowed it to drop. You assumed that the Americans would always protect us, and you just missed what was happening.
Well, I think across the Western world, defence budgets have been going down since the end of the Cold War as a proportion of GDP. Actually, our defence budget, as a share of our GDP, is one of the higher in NATO. I think it's in the top 5. It's certainly in the top half of the league table. But look, it was before as well. And Western countries as a whole have seen defence budgets go down after the Cold War. But it is, for obvious reasons, but it is clear now that with the way Russia is behaving, and other hostile states like Iran, North Korea are behaving, possibly even China in the South China Sea. It is clear we do live in a more dangerous world.
My point is Trump has said the Americans have paid essentially for our welfare spending. But actually, Biden and Obama said exactly the same things, and you didn't listen.
Well, I don't think that's true, because, as I say, we did get our defence spending over... The NATO target, Trevor, is... the NATO target is 2%. We've been consistently above that 2% and had a plan to get to 2.5%. But it's clear we do now need to go further.
All right, let's talk about how, in practice, we might go further. One way in which we could increase our defence capability is simply to have more people under arms. Latvian president told me this weekend that he'd expect other European nations to consider, as his country has done, conscription. Now, you're under new leadership, but actually, in your manifesto, you had a plan for national service. Would you still stand by that?
Well, it was National Citizen Service, wasn't it? And it was
one part of it was to put people in uniform. Would you still stand by that proposition?
Well, look, I think we're not going to obviously write our manifesto now, so I'm not going to recommit to things that were in the previous manifesto. We'll need to do the thinking properly. I'm not going to sort of speculate 4 years ahead.
You just spent 6 minutes telling me about the wonderful plans you had before when you were in government and how good they were. What's wrong with the plan that you put forward last June and July?
Well, nothing's wrong with it. I'm just saying...
national service.
No, there's nothing wrong at all with it. I'm just saying I'm not going to write the entire manifesto. Now, just in the same way, I wasn't going to give you details on exactly how our welfare policy would look, but I was saying in general terms, we need to get that welfare bill down.
So would conscription be something that would be on the table for you when you're thinking about the next Conservative government?
Well, I don't think it was really exactly conscription, what was being proposed. No. It was a national citizen service, which is a bit different. And as I say, look, I think the idea of getting younger people to do voluntary work and, perform useful tasks is not a bad idea. But, look, I'm not going to write the detail of the next manifesto now, and you wouldn't expect me to.
Well, one of the things that you are already saying is that you want to... The technical word is disapply the Human Rights Act to immigration. That is to say, to remove the rights of appeal, representation and so on from people who have migrated maybe in irregular ways. Is that quite where you want to be?
Well, so we think that the way UK judges are applying the ECHR in our domestic UK courts has sort of become out of control, and they've stretched these definitions so far. So, I mean, you'll know from your previous roles that some of these ECHR articles are very vaguely worded, things like a right to a family life or freedom from degrading treatment. Now, what do those mean in practice? Well, they mean whatever a judge says they mean. Now, if judges interpret those reasonably, that's fine. But what we've seen in the last few years in UK courts is judges have expanded these definitions wider and wider. So you've seen cases, for example, where somebody has illegally entered the UK, is trying to stay here, then joined a terror group in their country of origin in order to say, oh, if I go back, I'll be persecuted. Yet they chose to do that, essentially, for immigration purposes. There was a case of let me give you another example. There was a case of a Jamaican rapist who raped a woman and then sort of claimed to be bisexual in order to stop getting sent back to Jamaica. You get these sort of spurious claims the whole time, and we think...
Well,
let me finish.
You don't know that it's spurious, do you? What you want to do is to interfere with the judge's judgment.
Well, we want the judges in UK courts to apply only UK law that's been passed by Parliament, and obviously we would expect Parliament to legislate reasonably. Now, of course, if the person...
Both the cases you've just mentioned are English judges.
That's right. Because that's right. Because, as you know, but listeners may not, the Human Rights Act allows judges in the UK to apply their interpretation of these very vague ECHR articles. And they have stretched these definitions so far, in some cases it just defies common sense. We don't think UK judges should do that any longer for immigration cases. Instead, those judges should just apply the UK law passed by Parliament so we can restore some common sense. You know, there are 20,000 foreign criminals in the country who should have been removed but haven't been, largely because of the way these human rights laws have been applied. And those 20,000 people are posing a danger to our fellow citizens. What about their human rights?
Your big worry is reform, isn't it?
My big worry is the fact that we can't police our borders properly and we can't remove dangerous foreign criminals because the courts are using these increasingly absurd and common sense defying interpretations of the ECHR, and our amendment we're going to table tomorrow would end that.
Chris Phillips, thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you.
Next, we'll bring you a stark warning from the Latvian president, who says other European countries should consider conscription.
We're rolling.
Welcome to the world.
Our new podcast, starting now. It's very exciting. Every week, we'll be reporting from the world's trouble spots.
We get to hold those in positions of power accountable, and we get to ask the questions that the audience, the listeners, want to know about.
And that's why it is so important that people tune in, come along for the road, come along for the journey. It'll be fun.
The president of Latvia has told this programme that other European countries absolutely should consider bringing in military conscription and even higher defence spending. Edgars Rinkēvič said that it was sad that the Baltic states were not invited by the British government to the summit on Ukraine in London last week. Here's our exclusive interview with the Latvian president. Thank you for your time, Mr. President. Can we just start with this? You sparked attention after the Munich Security Conference a few weeks ago when you posted these words, "Never stop panicking." Are you panicking now?
No. Or I never stop panicking. But on a serious note, indeed, I think that what we need to understand that this is such time when things are developing so fast that keeping cool head, trying to figure out how to proceed in this rather difficult environment is very important. And of course, this was a bit ironic, a tweet, because we see how many things are developing at the same time.
Speaking of keeping cool heads, what have you made of our own Prime Minister's leadership over this period?
Well, I think it was a very good initiative to invite countries to London meeting. Said that the Baltic states, including Latvia, were not invited. I do hope that next time we are also going to sit at the table to discuss issues that are of importance to us and to Ukraine. But I think that the way how we are currently working out support for Ukraine and how we are discussing the need to strengthen European defense. And I'm very glad to see that the United Kingdom is now cooperating with EU nations, with Norway, with other nations, with Ukraine. I do believe that this is the way forward.
So you expect to be invited the next time the kind of gathering that we had here in London takes place?
Yes.
The American Defense Secretary has called it garbage to say that Donald Trump is pro-Russia. What's your attitude now to the Americans? Do you still have faith that they will be a reliable partner?
Well, the United States are NATO ally, and our cooperation with the United States is good. Definitely, as I said earlier, we do see the need also to apply equal pressure vis-à-vis Russia when it comes to the peace talks in Ukraine. We do see that the United States are right when it comes to requesting more defense spending for NATO European allies. But what I also believe is needed the kind of diplomatic approach that we try to explain our point of view to the United States, Ukrainians explain their point of view, and we work as a team. And I do hope that it's going to happen.
But given the way that the new American president has behaved over the last 3 or 4 weeks, the kind of diplomacy that you've put your faith in isn't much on show, is it, right now? Do you really feel comfortable with the way that the Americans have behaved, the way they've treated Ukraine, indeed the way they've treated you and the other Baltic states?
Well, I would say that there are ups and downs in the current international relations. As I said, I would definitely be happier to see that also Russia gets the kind of pressure that Ukraine gets. I do believe that we have very critical NATO summit in The Hague coming up, where we have to decide on how we work together when it comes to raising defense expenditures. In our context with the American administration, I would say that we are getting reassurances about commitment to the Article 5, but let's face it, we are concentrating very much on the United States. Unfortunately, what we are not talking so much only in recent days and weeks, what we as Europe should do. And we see that Europe currently is quite weak. We all understand that we do not have military capacity, but we also understand that we need to build it up. So my current suggestion would be, while I do see some differences with the United States when it comes to how to approach Ukraine, is to concentrate on our own task here in Latvia to raise defense expenditure. We are talking now about raising to 5%, and it's not only because the United States have this opinion, but also because our defense development plans suggest that. Second, how we address all our shortfalls at the European level, how we spend more money, how we develop defense industry, how we actually increase our capabilities. And if we get there, I think that also this kind of mutual understanding and also debate is going to change. Currently, unfortunately, we are in the process of understanding where we need to go. And now the most important thing is also not only to make political statements, but also to put money where the mouth is.
Well, let me ask you about that, Mr. President. Latvia has put a lot of money into defense, 4%. You're saying now that you want to raise it. You also introduced conscription for men. I understand you plan to introduce conscription for women in 2028. Let me ask you a couple of things. First of all, are you thinking now, given the circumstances, of bringing that 2028 date forward? And secondly, looking at your European partners, is this the kind of step that you would be looking to see them take to demonstrate the seriousness with which they take the current situation?
Well, I think some correction needs to be made. Indeed, we have reintroduced conscription called State Defense Service. And it's mandatory for males. Currently, we are still forming first units since 2023 based on more voluntary rather than mandatory base. But yes, there is discussion about whether we need to introduce the conscription also for women. Currently, that is not a decision that has been taken. And there is no any legal kind of obligation for that. But we are talking actually to reach higher numbers of our defense forces, not in 2028, but earlier. And then, of course, based on the current threat assessment, probably also to increase the number of the armed forces. That's where we stand. It's not like we are increasing, let's say, kind of conscription levels, including also women. I think that this is a debate, but there are no decisions taken. And yes, I do believe, answering your second question, that seeing what is happening in the world, the decision that we took, and yes, indeed, we had quite a discussion back in 2022, and that decision was taken by the parliament, that also many other European countries need to follow that.
Oh, you think other European countries need to take similar kind of decisions that you've taken in terms of level of spending, in terms perhaps of conscription?
Absolutely.
I want to ask you about your expectations of other Europeans. You're in the front line. First of all, how much do you and others in Latvia fear further incursions by the Russians, this time into the Baltic states, including Latvia? And what do you expect from your European colleagues in the face of further Russian aggression?
Well, I think that to some extent, all the war that Russia started against Ukraine has, of course, raised emotions and tensions. And of course, the past couple of weeks have been also very emotional here in Latvia. People are a little bit nervous. People are following the news. And I think that, of course, a strong reassurance is one thing. But another thing is the real action that is being taken by the Latvian government, by other European governments to make sure that we all get stronger. The Baltic states, to some extent, are the litmus test of both the European Union and NATO. And I think that sometimes when we get asked this question, there is a kind of understanding that the Baltic states are somewhere apart from NATO. No, we are NATO members and we are EU members. And I think that one simple message is that the attack against any of NATO member means attack against other NATO members, Europeans, non-Europeans. And if there is a failure to fulfill the Article 5, then I think everyone understands this is the end of NATO. I do have confidence that currently everyone understands the risks and the threats. What I do have also the confidence is that beyond this acknowledgement of Russia's aggression, by the way, we were talking about that for years, not months, but years, that we are also going to see that there is increase in defense spending, but also we believe that if we see that there is not a just and lasting peace in Ukraine, that if Russia is allowed to regroup, then the risks are increasing. And in that case, we also need to increase the overall presence here in the so-called eastern flank. So what is now important is not only declarations, but also how those declarations are being implemented. I'm fine with the wordings, but I see that we need also some deeds.
Mr. President, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
In just a moment, we'll hear once again from our panel.
Hear that whistle and that crunch. We know that they're coming from the south of the city where there's a column of Russian armoury. I'm Alex Crawford and I'm Sky's special correspondent based in Istanbul. Look at that sheet of flames, and that has happened within minutes, and now it's coming from both sides and it's moving this way.
Trust in politics is at an all-time low. What's going wrong and can we fix it? It's from Liz. She wants to know, why is there still no sign of the Labour Party electing a woman as leader?
It's sort of embarrassing. You know, it takes a very strong man to be leader, but it takes an even stronger man to support a woman for leader.
If you want to be mean to politicians, like, crack on. The activists that go out and make elections happen, I kind of feel like just don't be horrible to them. Be polite to them in the same way that they're polite to you.
Keir Starmer has got us into government with a big majority. He was completely clear before the election that he wasn't going to be able to do the two-child benefit policy, but I wouldn't be surprised if it isn't an early thing that comes along.
I went up to Gordon Brown and said, hello? No, yes, where is it? I said, found all these Tory candidates breaking land. Let me see it. This is brilliant.
You are on Sky News. Welcome to the BAFTAs.
I'm Katie Spencer, Sky's arts and entertainment correspondent, and from the BAFTAs to the Brit Awards, the Oscars to the Olivier's, our entertainment team is here interviewing some of the biggest stars in the world.
This is the story of the night. It's the little independent film that could.
Sky News, the full story first, free wherever you get your news.
Play Sky News.
From the Sky News Centre at 7.
Now that you're up to date, we can go into a bit more detail.
Things can change incredibly quickly.
Taken by surprise.
Have you ever known a moment like this in British politics before? Yes. Cheers.
We'll start with breaking news.
Let's get the latest on the ground.
So, by the end, we'll hopefully all understand what's going on in the world just that little better.
Sky News get the full story first.
Is this now all your territory?
Yeah.
The battlefield is outside the barricades. We are in the middle of a forest, in a jungle really, and they're attempting to keep these men alive. I'm Stuart Ramsey, and I'm Sky's chief correspondent. It's really dangerous. Many people have died riding it.
We are under Israeli military restrictions in terms of some of the things that we can film, but it's important to be in there. What a slow drive for the president as he approaches his golf club. Free wherever you get your news. I'm Mark Stone and I'm Sky's correspondent based here in Washington, DC.
Back to our panel, Fraser Nelson, Stephanie Flanders and Steve Richards. Steve, let's go back to Chris Philp. The Conservatives are saying today they want to bring immigration out of the scope of the Human Rights Act. We've had quite a flap this week with Robert Jenrick talking about two-tier justice because sentencing guidelines, which referred to ethnicity and sex and so on. It feels like a play to head off reform at the pass.
Yeah, and it's very interesting. We were talking about reform earlier, and the sudden possibility of fragility. But up until this point, I think both the main parties have been obsessed with the rise of reform, partly understandable. You know, they are worried they could lose seats to reform in a huge way, especially the Conservatives. However, I mean, it's become a cliche, but some cliches are right, that the Conservative Party, if they pitch for that reform vote, are not going to get back the support they lost to the Lib Dems. And so I was at a book festival in Oxfordshire the other week talking about it, and people were coming up to me, so you do realise in Oxfordshire we have no Tory MPs, the county of Cameron, Heseltine, and all these others. They've all gone to Lib Dem and Labour. So it's a titanic task, and it will involve great guile and skill. But just to target those reform voters will be a mistake, because they will not get back those that they need to get back to win a majority.
Fraser, what do you think? Can they pull it off?
Well, they need to be careful that they don't get sucked too far towards the new sort of radical online rights with the race baiting. I mean, talks about two-tier justice. This is a favourite theme of the digital race baiters, saying one rule effectively for the white man, another rule for the minorities, and this country is now biased against, I mean, Robert Jenrick was using this language last week, biased against like Christian white man, you're going to get a different treatment. Now, this is, what the funny thing was that he was referring to the changes in sentencing. Now, those sentences changes were first proposed and published under the last Conservative government. Not a squeak then about a two-tier justice, not a squeak about straight Christian men. This is a new change in the debate, which has been driven mainly by Twitter, but also by reform as well. Now, Nigel Farage, one of his problems with Rupert Lowe is he thinks Rupert Lowe is going too far down this digital right direction. He thinks it's a little bit too murky. But that can be a very strong whirlpool that can suck people into it. If the Conservatives aren't careful, they will get sucked into these race-baiting kind of hinterlands as well.
Let's look ahead. Stephanie, Rachel Reeves has got her spring statement March 26th, and she's going to tell us how she's going to resolve the dilemma of having no money but having to spend a lot of money. What's her task?
I mean, we've talked about it in different ways as regards to the Prime Minister, but it's certainly true of her as well. It's a reframing of the whole government agenda, which has been sort of gifted to them, or certainly put on their plate by what Donald Trump has done and the world as it's changing before our eyes. But I do think it gives her an opportunity. I think even just a couple of months ago, we would have said, oh, interest costs are going up. She had this tiny amount of headroom for meeting her fiscal rules. Now that's gone. Where's she going to get, the odd few billion? Where's she going to get the odd billion from here and there? I mean, she does have an opportunity to just reframe the whole thing. And if it is indeed welfare spending that she's looking for savings from, I think that could be around a whole, a new national mission. But we will come away from it saying, wow, we're not doing all these really difficult things to the welfare budget in order to put money into public services, in order to put money into the NHS. It's in order to put money into defence. And the broader public has to kind of be on side with that this is actually a time, we talk about, where conscription is probably not on the cards, but to start talking about what conditions would lead you to have conscription, I think would be quite a helpful thing. Just as we used to get all those instructions, our parents used to get instructions about the nuclear bomb shelters. It wasn't that it was about to happen, but it was more of a reality in people's heads.
You say conscription's not on the cards, but, it's a lot of Europeans. Mind you, we're not in part of that club anymore. But, Steve, there's a lot of talk on the left now, I think, about rearmament-driven growth. How's that going to play?
Well, there is an argument that it will lead to economic growth if the money is spent wisely, a big if. But, there are other infrastructure projects too that will generate economic growth, which will presumably now will never happen. And so, this is part of the choice, it seems, although it doesn't have to be. Are we going to scrap any idea of a modern railway system? The only country in most of Europe without high-speed rail, all that out of the window. This is not infrastructure as such, but are we going to drop any hope of a national care service, all for this new focus on defence? And so these are hugely, the public spending round before the international crisis was already nightmarishly tight. And if they're going to pursue this theme of security at home and abroad, the Home Office facing cuts, other departments facing cuts which are related to domestic security. So the reframing needs to deal with this.
And one of the factors that affects whether it actually adds to growth is whether you're buying all the weapons from the US or you're buying them from other countries in Europe. And that is one of the big debates, even between the French and the Germans, is over whether they, in this extra spending that they're going to borrow money collectively for, how much of that is going to be on European arms versus US arms. And I think
British trade unions are already grumbling about that. Now, look, I cannot let you, Fraser, escape from the studio without making the point that you've been causing tremendous trouble about Englishness over the last couple of weeks by asserting that it is apparently possible to be English if you are not white and Christian. What's wrong with you?
Well, as a Scot, I'm sort of slightly cautious to talk too much about Englishness. But the thing is, in Scotland, we had this debate a long time ago when nationalism came across. It says, who is Scottish? Who qualifies? Now, of course, it's ethnicity and it's a civic identity. It is both things. You can be ethnically white and Scottish, white and English. The census gives you these options. But Hamza Yusuf, for example, is emphatically Scottish. Born in Glasgow, not even his worst enemy would say that he isn't Scottish. Now, why should that not apply to England? I was really surprised. To me, I was stating the obvious, saying that Rishi Sunak is one of the most English people you can imagine. He's a head boy at Winchester, a cricketing fanatic. He's so polite. He could be a Monty Python caricature of the Englishman who was too polite to be Prime Minister. But to hear people say, no, he can't because the colour of his skin was strange. But to hear Suella Braverman, a former Home Secretary, also say, look at me, I can't be English because of the colour of my skin, was just bizarre. I think the answer is that Englishness needs to be talked about more and embraced. It's a great thing to be English. I like to think that all three of my children can be seen as English, even if neither of their parents are, because a country always evolves. That's the strength of countries. And Englishness is a great thing to have. No matter what colour of your skin is, you can be incredibly English, as Rishi Sunak shows.
Just very briefly, in a sort of very English, consensual way, do you two agree?
Yes.
Yes.
And that used to be the definition. If you go to America, that was the thing that Ronald Reagan and others used to applaud about America, is that anybody could arrive there and be American.
But you can have a Monty Python-style row about this, Suella Braverman joining others. It's easier to have rows about this than sorting out these other issues we've been talking about.
Back next week, 08:30.